The sun beats down on a 16th century Brazilian sugar plantation with a heat that feels personal. In the center of a dusty clearing, a group of men, stripped to the waist and glistening with sweat, move in a slow, circular procession. A single-stringed instrument, the berimbau, provides a twanging, hypnotic rhythm. To the Portuguese overseer watching from the shade of his porch, this is merely a Sunday ritual, a harmless, primitive amusement for the human property he manages. He sees swaying hips, acrobatic cartwheels, and smiles. He sees a lack of discipline. He sees a culture that, in his mind, has been successfully broken. He turns his back, satisfied that these men pose no threat to his musket or his whip. But the man on the porch is blind to the biomechanical reality unfolding 10 yards away. He does not see that the dance is actually a high-level military drill. He doesn't notice that the acrobatic cartwheel is a tactical evasion designed to position a fighter behind an opponent's guard. He fails to hear that the festive song being chanted is a rhythmic instruction for a coordinated ambush. Most importantly, he does not realize that he is looking at the world's first psychological operation on a grand scale. This wasn't a performance for his benefit. It was a laboratory for lethal techniques, disguised as folklore to avoid a death sentence. Throughout human history, the most effective weapons were not made of steel or gunpowder, but of deception. For the enslaved and the oppressed, training for combat was a crime punishable by torture or execution. To survive, they had to hide their lethality in plain sight. They took the very things their masters considered signs of inferiority, music, rhythm, and festive movement, and weaponized them into a system of war that could shatter a skull as easily as it could entertain a crowd. This is the story of how the rhythm of the drum became the rhythm of revolution. It is a journey into the tactics of the disposed, a deep dive into the hidden martial arts of the African and Asian diasporas. We are looking at a world where a smile hides a killing blow, where a drumbeat replaces a general's command, and where the most oppressed people on earth developed lethal dances that allowed them to dismantle professional, well-armed colonial armies with nothing but their bare hands and the rhythm in their blood. By the time the colonial powers realized that the festivities were actually elite military preparation, the chains were already being broken. This is the history of the invisible weapon, the martial art masked as a dance. The genesis of this martial deception begins in the Senzalas, the cramped, suffocating slave quarters of colonial Brazil. Millions of people from the West and Central African regions, primarily the Kingdom of Congo and the lands of Angola, were poured into the ports of the New World. They were stripped of their names, their clothes, and their weapons, but they could not be stripped of their kinetic culture. They brought with them the Negolo, or the zebra dance, a ritualized combat from the highlands of southern Angola. But in the New World, under the constant paranoid scrutiny of Portuguese guards, the Negolo had to evolve. It had to become something far more sophisticated and far more hidden. It became Capoeira. The very name is a piece of historical misdirection, likely referring to the short grass areas where escaped slaves would hide to ambush their pursuers. The foundation of this system is a movement called the Ginga. To the uninitiated, it looks like a rhythmic, swaying step, a decorative part of a performance. But analyze it through the lens of a modern combat specialist, and its true purpose emerges. The Ginga is a state of constant, fluid transition. Unlike the static stance of a boxer or a fencer, the capoeirista is never a stationary target. The swaying motion creates a visual blur, making it incredibly difficult for an opponent to telegraph when or where an attack will originate. It is the physical manifestation of Malicia, the Portuguese word for cunning. Malicia teaches a fighter to look weak when they are strong, to look distracted when they are focused, and to lure the opponent into a false sense of security. The biomechanics developed in these slave quarters were born of necessity. Because slaves were often chained by their wrists, the art developed a heavy, almost exclusive reliance on the lower body and the head. The Meia-Lua de Compasso, or the compassing half moon, is perhaps the most efficient striking maneuver ever devised for an unarmed fighter. By placing one or both hands on the ground and dropping the head low, the practitioner turns their entire body into a centrifugal engine. The resulting kick generates a force that far exceeds a standard standing kick, capable of shattering a colonial soldier's musket or killing a man instantly. To a Portuguese officer, it simply looked like a flamboyant, acrobatic tumble, a childlike display of energy. They didn't realize that the practitioner was using the ground as a pivot point to weaponize gravity itself. The rota, the circle in which the practitioners moved, served as the ultimate tactical simulation. The music, controlled by the bateria or the band of instruments, wasn't just background noise, it was an early warning system. Specific rhythms like the cavalleria were coded signals. If a guard or a patrol was spotted approaching the clearing, the tempo would change instantly, and the lethal combat would soften into a harmless-looking folk dance. By the time the authority figure arrived, he saw only contented laborers singing songs of the old country. This hidden training bore its most significant fruit in the quilombos, independent settlements of escaped slaves in the dense, mountainous Brazilian interior. The most legendary of these was Palmares, which survived for nearly a century against the combined military might of the Portuguese and the Dutch empires. The soldiers of Palmares were not just rebels, they were elite guerrilla fighters who used the low-to-the-ground movements of capoeira to navigate the thick jungle underbrush unseen and launch devastating ambushes. European chronicles from the 17th century describe Negroes who fight with a devilish agility, noting that they seemed to prefer fighting without clothes to prevent being grabbed, and that they could strike with their feet as if they were hands. The dance was no longer a secret. It was a nightmare for the colonial administration. After the fall of Palmares, the art didn't disappear. It went further underground, into the urban underworld of Rio de Janeiro. In the 19th century, capoeira gangs, known as maltas, terrorized the city. They were so effective that they were often hired as mercenaries by rival political factions. These fighters were known for carrying hidden blades between their toes and using patalas, or razors, concealed in their clothing to complement their kicks. The dance had become so dangerous to the state that in 1890, shortly after the abolition of slavery, the newly formed Brazilian Republic officially banned capoeira, declaring that any practitioner would be sentenced to hard labor. But the government faced a fundamental problem. How do you ban a movement? How do you arrest a man for dancing? The capoeiristas simply added more music, more theatricality, and more show to their training. They hid their lethality behind an even thicker veil of folklore, ensuring that while the colonial era ended, the warrior spirit of the Senzalas survived, sharpened by the rhythm of the drum and the secret language of the body. This was just the first chapter in a global phenomenon of martial masquerade, where the oppressed realized that if they couldn't carry a sword, they would have to become the sword themselves. As the pulse of the berimbau fades in the south, a different, sharper rhythm takes hold further north in the Caribbean archipelago. If Brazil was the laboratory for the legs, the islands of Trinidad, Haiti, and Jamaica became the forge for the stick and the blade. Across the West Indies, the colonial authorities lived in a state of constant, low-level paranoia. They were outnumbered, sometimes 100 to 1, and they knew that the only thing keeping the plantation system intact was the total disarmament of the enslaved population. To possess a weapon was a death sentence. To be seen practicing combat was to invite the whip. And so, once again, the art of war retreated behind the mask of the festival. In the 18th and 19th centuries, the sound of the drums in Trinidad signaled the start of the Kalinda. To the British and French governors, it appeared to be a chaotic, boisterous display of ego, men dancing in a circle, singing boastful songs, and engaging in stick play that looked like a clumsy version of fencing. They called it carré, or jeu de bois. They saw it as a primitive pastime, a way for the laborers to vent their aggression on each other rather than on their masters. They couldn't have been more wrong. The Kalinda was a sophisticated high-speed martial system designed to produce elite shock troops for the coming revolutions. The weapon of choice was the bois, a stick made of pui wood, cured in fire and often soaked in oil to make it as hard as iron. The dancers, known as boismen, operated within a gael, a sacred circle of combat. The songs they sang, the lavways, were not just music. They were a complex system of oral history and tactical signaling. The lead singer, the chantuelle, would use the lyrics to call out an opponent's weaknesses or to warn the fighter of a shifting guard. While the drums dictated the pace, the boismen were practicing a system of parries and strikes that were mathematically precise. Unlike European fencing, which relied on linear movement, the Calinda utilized circular footwork and explosive rhythms. The fighter's body was never static. The constant dancing kept the muscles warm and the nervous system primed for a twitch response. To an untrained eye, the boyman's flamboyant spins and theatrical flourishes looked like showing off. In reality, those spins were used to generate massive centrifugal force, turning a simple wooden rod into a weapon capable of shattering a skull through a leather military helmet. When the Haitian Revolution finally ignited in 1791, the French soldiers were horrified to find that the dancing slaves they had laughed at for years were now moving with a terrifying, synchronized lethality that the European line and rank tactics could not contain. The dance had become a massacre. But the most complex example of this martial masquerade occurred half a world away, in the Philippine archipelago. For over 300 years, the Spanish Empire held the Philippines under a suffocating grip. They recognized early on that the indigenous Kali systems, the arts of the sword and the knife, were among the most efficient in the world. To neutralize the threat, the Spanish issued a total ban on all traditional weapons and the practice of any native fighting styles. The Filipinos responded with a stroke of genius that would preserve their warrior culture for centuries. They hid their entire military manual inside the Moro Moro plays. The Moro Moro was a form of folk theater encouraged by Spanish friars, which depicted the battles between Christians and Muslims. Because the plays were religious in nature, the Spanish encouraged the locals to perform them with as much energy as possible. The Filipinos took this permission and ran with it. They replaced their steel blades with rattan sticks or wooden swords, and they choreographed the stage fights using the authentic, lethal patterns of Kali. They called this disguised art arnis or eskrima. In the middle of a town square, under the watchful eyes of Spanish officers, Filipino practitioners were perfecting the sinawali, the weaving patterns. To the officers, it looked like a beautiful rhythmic dance, where two performers would strike their sticks together in a complex repetitive flow. It was mesmerizing, decorative, and seemingly harmless. But the sinawali was actually a high-level coordination drill designed to program the practitioner's brain for double weapon combat. Every clack of the sticks represented a parry, a check, and a counter-strike. By practicing these dances for hours every day, the Filipinos were developing muscle memory that was so deep it became instinctual. They developed the abanico, or fan strike, mimicking the innocent motion of a lady's folding fan to deliver a rapid-fire series of strikes that could break a wrist or blind an eye in less than a second. They hid their sword and dagger techniques in the graceful movements of traditional regional dances. When the Philippine Revolution finally broke out in 1896, the Spanish were shocked to find that the peasant actors were moving with a speed and precision that defied logic. The stage fighters were suddenly using their rattan sticks as if they were lightning bolts, and when they managed to reclaim their steel bolos, the transition from dance to war was instantaneous. They hadn't just been playing, they had been drilling for 3 centuries. This theme of the hidden pattern repeats itself across history because it exploits a fundamental flaw in the psychology of the oppressor: arrogance. The master always assumes that the slave's culture is inferior, that his music is just noise, and his movements are just superstition. This arrogance creates a blind spot. The oppressed person lives in that blind spot. They understand that rhythm is a powerful tool for synchronization. In military terms, drill is what turns a mob into an army. No mob practicing drill is suspicious. A group of people dancing to a drum is festive. By using music as a metronome, these lethal dancers were able to train their reaction times to a level that no professional soldier could match. A soldier trains when his sergeant tells him to. A Calinda fighter or an escrimador trains every time the music starts, which in a village setting was nearly every night. They turned their entire lives into a continuous military exercise, masked by a smile and a song. They weaponized the very stereotypes that were used to dehumanize them. If the master thinks the slave is childlike and fond of dancing, then the slave will dance his way into a position where he can strike the master's throat. This wasn't just about physical survival, it was about the preservation of the soul. In the Gael or the Rhoda, the oppressed man was no longer a piece of property. He was a king, a warrior, a master of his own space. Every spinning kick and every rhythmic stick strike was an act of rebellion. The music provided a sacred space where the laws of the colony did not apply. Within the circle, the dancer was free. This psychological liberation was the necessary precursor to the physical liberation that followed. You cannot lead a revolution if you have already been broken in spirit. The lethal dances ensured that while the body was in chains, the warrior spirit was being sharpened every single day, waiting for the drumbeat to change to the rhythm of war. This secret language of the body, how certain movements were designed to be invisible even to the person being hit, became the ultimate weapon of the weak against the strong. It was the science of the underdog, the biomechanics of the ghost, and the history of the rhythm that kills. The true genius of these hidden arts lies not just in their history, but in the sophisticated science of deception that governs every move. To understand how a dance can become a killing system, we must look at the biomechanics of the invisible strike. In conventional combat sports, efficiency is usually defined by the shortest distance between 2 points, a straight jab or a direct kick. But in the lethal dances of the oppressed, efficiency was defined by the broken beat. If you move in a predictable, linear fashion, a trained soldier can react. But if you move to a syncopated rhythm, shifting your weight on the offbeat, you bypass the human brain's ability to process anticipation. This is the science of the ghost strike. By utilizing the undulating movements of a dance, the fighter masks the telegraph, those tiny muscular cues that tell an opponent an attack is coming. In Capoeira, this is the mastery of the torso. In harness, it is the circular motion of the wrists. The attack doesn't come from a static position. It emerges out of a continuous flow. By the time the opponent realizes the dance has ended and the fight has begun, the impact has already landed. This is Malicia in its purest physical form, the art of being elsewhere while appearing to be right in front of you. It is a psychological assault as much as a physical one. When a practitioner smiles, spins, or drops to the ground, they are overloading the opponent's sensory input with noise, making the actual signal of the strike impossible to detect until it is too late. This deception extended to the tools of the trade. When blades were banned, the dancers turned their clothing and daily implements into an arsenal. In the urban slums of 19th century Brazil, the Maltas perfected the use of the navalha, or straight razor. They didn't carry these razors in holsters. They hid them in the brims of their hats, between their toes, or sewn into the silk of their waistbands. A sweeping dance movement wasn't just a kick. It was a delivery system for a hidden edge that would open a femoral artery or a throat in a flash of silver that looked like a mere flourish of the hand. In the Caribbean, the boymen cured their sticks in fire and buried them in the earth for months to create a density that rivaled steel. Yet to an overseer, it was just a piece of wood for a walking stick or a festive game. On the plantations of the American South, where even the drum was sometimes banned for fear of coded communication, the enslaved people developed padding juba, a complex system of body percussion. While it looked like a rhythmic celebration, the foot stomping and hand clapping were actually drills for developing the explosive power and coordination needed for close quarters grappling and rough and tumble fighting. They were training their central nervous systems to fire with the precision of a piston, all while appearing to be caught in the grip of a musical trance. As the 20th century dawned and the chains of formal slavery were broken, these arts faced their greatest challenge, the move from the shadows into the light. In Brazil, Mestre Bimba revolutionized capoeira by creating the regional style, stripping away some of the ritual to prove the art's efficacy to the middle class. He famously challenged fighters of any discipline to face him, and his success led to the legalization of the art in the 1930s. But this transition came at a price. As these lethal dances were codified into sports and cultural heritage, much of the killing edge, the Malicia, and the hidden applications of the moves was sanitized. The Meia-Lua that was meant to crush a skull became a high-flying kick meant to score points in a tournament. The Philippine arnis was systematized into competitive sparring with padded suits and headgear. The world began to see these arts as performative or acrobatic, forgetting that their original purpose was the systematic destruction of an enemy in a life-or-death struggle. Yet, the core DNA of the dance remains. Today, when you watch a world-class MMA fighter use unconventional footwork or a spinning elbow that seems to come from nowhere, you are seeing the echoes of the Senzala and the Gael. Modern sports science is finally catching up to what the dancing slaves knew 500 years ago. That circular movement, deceptive rhythm, and fluidity of the spine are the keys to overcoming a stronger, more rigid opponent. The legacy of these screaming dances is not found in the trophies of a gymnasium, but in the enduring spirit of resistance they represent. They are a testament to the fact that you can take everything from a human being, their name, their land, their freedom, and their weapons, but you cannot take their rhythm. These arts were a way for the dispossessed to reclaim their bodies and their dignity. In a world that told them they were nothing more than beasts of burden, the dance told them they were warriors. It was a secret language spoken through the motion of the hips and the strike of the palm. It was a reminder that the power to change one's reality starts with the mastery of one's own movement. The lethal dance was the ultimate act of subversion because it turned the oppressor's own gaze against him. It used his arrogance as a shield and his ignorance as a weapon. Every time a practitioner enters the Rota or the Gael today, they are participating in an unbroken chain of defiance that stretches back through centuries of blood and dust. They are honoring the men and women who fought for their lives with a song in their throats and a killer instinct in their heels. We must realize that the dance of the slave was never about the dance itself. It was about the freedom that the dance represented. It was a tactical adaptation to a world of total surveillance and absolute violence. It taught us that when the front door is barred and the weapons are confiscated, the warrior must find another way. They must become like water, fluid, adaptable, and capable of crashing through the strongest stone. They must learn to move through the gaps in the enemy's perception. As we look back at the history of the invisible weapon, we see a universal truth of combat. The most dangerous fighter is not the one with the biggest sword, but the one who can smile while they prepare to strike, the one who can turn a rhythmic sway into a revolution. The drums may have changed, and the plantations may have vanished, but the militia remains. It lives in the shadow of the gym, in the subtext of the movement, and in the hearts of those who know that true power is never given. It is practiced in secret, until the moment arrives to strike. This is the enduring mystery of the lethal dance, a story of how the rhythm of the heart, when synchronized with the intent of the spirit, becomes the most unstoppable force in human history. The dance continues, not as a performance, but as a living, breathing manual of survival for anyone who finds themselves with their back against the wall and nothing but the beat of their own heart to guide them. It is the final victory of the oppressed over the oppressor, the transformation of a ritual of pain into a legacy of power. In every spinning kick, in every weaving stick, and in every syncopated step, the ghosts of the past are still fighting, still dancing, and still proving that the rhythm of freedom can never be silenced.